You can't go on this journey with him. What? Why? He's dangerous. You have to trust me. I don't understand.
There is a sound that changes everything. Not a gunshot. Not a scream. Not the crash of something breaking. It is far quieter than that. It is the sound that almost no one pays attention to at 5:47 in the morning when the sky outside is still the color of an old bruise, and the only light on your porch is that thin yellow glow that does absolutely nothing against the dark. It is the sound of 3 knocks on a door. 3 knocks. Measured. Deliberate. Each one placed with the weight of a decision that someone had clearly been wrestling with all night long. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. And then silence. The kind of silence that does not feel like nothing, it feels like the whole world holding its breath, waiting to see what you do next. I almost did not answer it. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I want you to really feel the weight of that sentence, because the entire story you are about to hear, every twist, every revelation, every moment that will make you question everything you think you know about the person you sleep next to, all of it hinges on the fact that I almost walked away from that door. I had been awake since 5 a.m. My bags were already packed and sitting by the bedroom door. Our flight to the Maldives departed at 9, and I was doing what I always do when I travel, obsessively checking that I had not forgotten anything, mentally rehearsing the packing list, making sure every small detail was in order. I was, by every outward appearance, a woman on her way to paradise. And in a matter of minutes, a stranger standing on my porch in the cold dark of a Georgia morning was going to make sure I understood exactly why I would never have made it back. My name is Diana Washington. And this is the story of the morning that saved my life. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something about the woman standing on my porch. She was not a neighbor. She was not a friend. She was not someone I had ever spoken to outside of the occasional brief, professional nod in a hallway. Her name was Claire Hartley. She was 34 years old, Australian by birth, and she had been working as my husband's personal assistant for the better part of 3 years. And if you are wondering why that detail matters, why a woman with a work visa, a leased apartment, and absolutely everything to lose would drive across town before sunrise on a Tuesday morning to warn the wife of the men who signed her paychecks, then I need you to keep watching. Because that question is the thread that unravels the entire thing. Here is what I want you to hold in your mind throughout this story. Who was Jerome Washington, really, the man I had trusted not just with my heart, but with my mother's entire legacy? What was the plan that Claire had discovered? And what, exactly, was supposed to happen to me on day 3 of that Maldives vacation? I am not going to rush you to those answers. Because the only way this story makes sense, the only way any of it lands with the weight it deserves, is if you understand exactly how we got here. How a love story became a conspiracy. How a marriage became a trap. And how one woman's decision to speak up, at great personal risk, changed the course of everything. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second right now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. My mother, Evelyn Washington, was not supposed to succeed. That is the thing people who did not know her always seem to miss when they hear her story. She was a black woman who started a business in the American South in the mid-1980s with $3,000 and a clarity of purpose that most people twice her age never find. She had no MBA. She had no business contacts. She had no one handing her opportunities or opening doors. What she had was an unshakable belief that she could build something real, something lasting, something that would outlive her and provide for everyone who depended on her, including, one day, me. By the time I was 12 years old, Evelyn Washington's company employed more than 200 people. It was a logistics and supply chain management firm, not glamorous, not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but exactly the kind of infrastructure that keeps other businesses alive. She had contracts with regional distributors, hospital supply chains, and small to medium retailers across 3 states. Her client list was quietly impressive. Her reputation in the industry was immaculate. And her name, in the rooms that mattered, in the quiet, carpeted offices where real decisions get made, carried a weight that she had built entirely herself, one handshake, one late night, one unbroken promise at a time. She used to say to me, almost like a prayer she repeated so often that it became part of the furniture of my childhood, "Diana, this is yours one day. Guard it like your life depends on it." She was not being dramatic when she said that. She was being precise. She had watched too many Black-owned businesses get dismantled from the inside, by partners who could not be trusted, by advisors who had their own interests at heart, by the slow creep of complacency that turns a thriving operation into a cautionary tale. She had seen it happen to people she respected. She had no intention of becoming one of them. And neither did I. What neither of us could have anticipated, what I do not think any amount of her wisdom or my awareness could have prepared either of us for, was that the threat would not come from the outside. It would come from the men I loved. The men I chose. The men I placed at the center of everything she had ever built. I met Jerome Washington at a charity gala in Atlanta 7 years ago. He was 41 years old, impeccably dressed, and the kind of man who enters a room and immediately makes you understand why certain people get described as magnetic. He had an MBA from a well-regarded institution. He had spent the previous decade working in corporate operations and turnaround consulting, the kind of work that requires you to walk into struggling companies, identify the rot, and rebuild systems from the ground up. He was articulate. He was charming. He was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man who would have impressed my mother, which, if I am being honest with myself, was one of the things that drew me to him most. Not consciously. But looking back, I can see it clearly now. We dated for 18 months. He was present in a way I was not used to. He remembered details. He asked questions. He made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone was genuinely paying attention to who I was beneath the surface. He proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening in my backyard, with no audience, no performance, just the 2 of us, the smell of honeysuckle in the air, and a ring that he had clearly spent real time thinking about. It was, by any measure, one of the most sincerely romantic moments of my life. I said yes without hesitation. My mother was alive then. She cried when she heard the news. She hugged Jerome. She said she was glad I had found someone worthy of me. She passed away 14 months after our wedding. A stroke, sudden and swift, the way these things sometimes go with people who refuse to slow down until their body refuses to let them continue at speed. She was 62 years old. She left behind a company, a legacy, a community of employees who had built their lives around what she had created, and one daughter who was still in the thick of grief when the full weight of inheritance landed on her shoulders. I was not ready to run the company. I knew it. Jerome knew it. And to his credit, at least, to what I believed was his credit at the time, he stepped in immediately. He said he would take the CEO role temporarily, just to stabilize things while I processed the loss, learned the business more deeply, and prepared to take the reins when I was ready. It seemed like the most generous thing a partner could offer. It seemed like exactly the kind of husband I had married. I put his name on the executive line. I gave him operational authority. I handed him the keys to everything my mother had built. And I trusted him completely. That trust was the most expensive mistake I have ever made. Claire Hartley arrived in Atlanta 4 years ago from Sydney, Australia, on a work visa. She had spent the previous 6 years working in executive administration across 2 different industries, first in mining operations in Western Australia, then in financial services in Sydney's CBD. She was methodical, precise, and exceptionally good at the kind of invisible labor that keeps a CEO's world running smoothly without him ever having to think about it. She managed Jerome's schedule, his correspondence, his travel arrangements, his meeting preparation, and the 100 small details that accumulate in the daily life of a person running a mid-sized company. She was professional to the point of being almost invisible. That was her style. That was what she prided herself on. I did not know Claire well. We had spoken perhaps 20 times in 3 years, brief, courteous exchanges at company events, or when I stopped by the office to see Jerome. She was always polished. Always appropriate. Always the picture of someone who understood exactly where the lines were and had no interest in crossing them. If I had been asked at the start of any of this to describe her, I would have said she seemed like a very competent person doing a very contained job. I would not have said she was someone who would one day drive to my house before 6 in the morning to save it. But the thing about Claire that I would only come to understand fully later is this: she had a conscience that she could not turn off, even when turning it off would have been far easier and far safer for her. She had grown up in a family where doing the right thing was not optional, it was simply what you did, regardless of the cost. Her mother had been a labor rights advocate in New South Wales for over 2 decades. Her father was a retired schoolteacher who had spent 30 years in underfunded public schools by choice, because he believed that was where he was needed most. She had been raised, quietly and consistently, to believe that silence in the face of a wrong is its own kind of participation. That if you know something that would change everything for someone, and you say nothing, you carry some of the weight of what happens next. That belief was about to cost her almost everything she had built in this country. And she had made peace with that before she ever knocked on my door. The night Claire found out what Jerome was planning was a Wednesday, 6 weeks before our scheduled vacation. She had stayed late at the office, which was not unusual for her, to pull together documents for a meeting Jerome had early the following morning. He had asked her earlier that day to find a specific vendor contract from a folder on his computer. She had his login credentials, as she often did for administrative purposes. She opened the folder. She found the contract. And then, in the file tree beside it, she noticed something that made her pause. A folder she did not recognize. A folder with no label, just a date. The date was 2 weeks away from their current day. And the name of the subfolder inside it was one she would later tell me she will never forget for the rest of her life. The subfolder was labeled simply, DW Final. She should have closed it. She knew, on some level, that she should have closed it and walked away. But she clicked it. And what she found inside was not a vendor contract. It was not a business document. It was an email chain, private, running several months back, between Jerome Washington and a man named Darnell Okafor. And the deeper she read, the colder the office seemed to get, even though the thermostat had not moved. Darnell Okafor was 46 years old, and he had been circling my mother's company for the better part of 2 years. I say circling because that is the only word that captures it accurately, the slow, patient orbit of a person who wants something badly enough to wait for the right moment, and who is calculating enough to understand that the right moment requires preparation. He had approached Jerome early in his tenure as CEO with what he framed as a partnership opportunity. He was interested, he said, in acquiring a significant stake in the company. He had investors. He had capital. He wanted in. Jerome had told me about that first meeting. He had presented it as something he had firmly shut down. He had used the word protective when he described his response to me. He had held my hand across the kitchen table and told me he would never let someone like Darnell get near what my mother had built. He had been lying to me from the moment he said it. The email chain that Claire found told a story that was nothing like the one Jerome had given me. It was a story of 2 men who had been carefully, methodically, over the course of 18 months, constructing a plan. Darnell wanted the company. Jerome wanted money, a great deal of it, far more than his CEO compensation provided, and far more than he would receive in any divorce settlement, given the prenuptial agreement my mother's attorney had insisted on before our wedding. A divorce would leave Jerome with nothing beyond what we had built together during the marriage. The company itself and everything associated with it would remain mine entirely. The prenup was airtight. Jerome knew that. He had signed it. He had smiled through the entire signing. And then, apparently, he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to figure out how to get around it. The answer they arrived at was not complicated. It was not sophisticated. It was a decision that Jerome had arrived at with a cold and unsettling speed. If Diana Washington died, if she died as the result of an accident, the kind of accident that happens to people on vacations in remote places far from home, then everything transferred. The company. The assets. The client contracts. The real estate holdings. The accounts. All of it would pass to Jerome as her surviving spouse, because I had not updated my beneficiary documents since before we married. I had intended to. I had mentioned it to Nathaniel, my mother's attorney, twice. Life had kept getting in the way. Jerome had never reminded me. I understand now why he had never reminded me. The Maldives trip was Jerome's idea from the very start, from the moment he suggested it, from the research he had done, from the specific island destination he had chosen. He had not chosen it for the beauty of the water. He had not chosen it for the romance. He had chosen it because it was remote. Because the surrounding ocean had documented currents that had claimed lives before. Because a private boat excursion in that part of the world, paid for in cash under a name that could not be immediately traced, could be arranged. And because a woman who goes overboard in those waters, in those conditions, at the right time of day, does not always come back. Jerome had done his research. He had been thorough. According to what Claire later laid out for investigators, the email chain included specific references to a local boat operator, a man who had been paid a significant amount in advance, through a series of transfers that ran through Darnell's business accounts rather than Jerome's personal ones. Day 3 of the trip had been earmarked. The excursion was supposedly a sunset cruise. The currents in that area are most dangerous in the late afternoon, when the tides shift and the water moves in ways that even experienced swimmers struggle against. Jerome was a strong swimmer. I was not. He had already consulted with an attorney about the inheritance structure before that trip was ever proposed to me. Claire found the record of that consultation in the same folder. He had already run the numbers. He already knew what he stood to gain. He had already mapped the pathway from a Maldivian sunset to a company headquarters on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia, and the only thing standing between Jerome Washington and everything my mother had ever built was the fact that I was still alive. That was the plan. That was what was in the folder. And Claire Hartley sat in that empty office, in that silent building, and read every word of it. I want to talk about what it must have felt like to be Claire Hartley in those hours after she closed that laptop. Because I think it is easy to hear a story like this and assume that the right thing to do was obvious, that any decent person would have immediately picked up the phone, called the police, called me, done something. But I do not think it was obvious at all. I think it was one of the hardest nights of her life. Claire was in the United States on a work visa. Her entire legal right to remain in this country was tied to her employment. Jerome Washington was her employer. She had no close family here, no safety net, no fallback position. She had spent 4 years building a life in Atlanta, an apartment she loved, a handful of friendships, a reputation in her field that she had cultivated carefully. She had a cat. She had a neighborhood she walked through every morning. She had a favorite coffee shop where they knew her order. She had a life. And every element of that life was, in that moment, in direct conflict with the thing she now knew. She told me later that she drafted a resignation letter that night. She sat at her kitchen table after midnight and wrote it. She told herself it was not her business. She told herself she could leave quietly, fly back to Sydney, and let whatever was going to happen, happen. She told herself that she was not Diana's friend, not Diana's protector, not Diana's anything. She told herself that people made their own choices and suffered their own consequences, and it was not her job to insert herself into the middle of someone else's marriage. She told herself all of it. She typed the letter. She read it back. And then she closed the laptop without saving it. Because she had Googled my name. Somewhere in the middle of that night, before she got to the resignation letter, she had looked me up. She found the company website. She read the About page, which included a brief history of my mother and the story of how Evelyn Washington had built the business. There was a photograph of my mother, one of those professional headshots that somehow manages to capture something real about a person despite its formality. My mother is smiling in it, but not in the way people smile for cameras. She is smiling in the way someone smiles when they are genuinely proud of where they are standing. Claire told me she looked at that photograph for a long time. She told me she thought about what my mother had given her life to build. She thought about the hundreds of employees who came to work every day inside what Evelyn Washington had created. She thought about me, still in the early years of grief, still finding my footing, still trusting the men beside me to help hold everything together. And then she thought about what it would look like if she said nothing. She thought about the morning after the accident, when Jerome would answer the phone with a voice calibrated perfectly to sound like a man in shock. She thought about the funeral. She thought about Darnell Okafor walking into the company's boardroom a few weeks later. She thought about a folder labeled DW Final, and the meaning of that word, final, and what it said about the way Jerome Washington had come to think of his wife. She set her alarm for 5 a.m. She found our home address in the company directory. She printed it on a single sheet of paper, folded it carefully, and put it in the pocket of the coat she laid out by her front door. She did not sleep. She told me later that she did not even try. I opened the door in my robe. I remember being briefly annoyed at whatever this was, some delivery, some neighbor with an emergency, something that was about to make me late, when I was already running on the tight margin of a 9 a.m. departure. I pulled the door open with the half-focused energy of someone whose mind is already somewhere else, already at the airport, already on the plane. And then I saw her face. Claire Hartley was standing on my porch in a dark coat, and she looked like someone who had been up all night, which she had. Her eyes were clear but exhausted. Her hands were clasped in front of her, very still, in the way people hold their hands still when they are using every available unit of self-control to keep themselves together. She was not crying. She looked like she was very deliberately not crying. And she looked at me with an expression I have never been able to fully describe, but that I understood immediately, the look of someone about to change your life and knowing it, and not being certain you will thank them for it. She said, "Mrs. Washington, my name is Claire Hartley. I work for your husband. And I need you to please not get on that plane today." My first instinct was confusion. My second was a kind of reflexive skepticism. Who is this person? Why is she here? What is the agenda? My third instinct, and this is the one I have thought about most in the years since, was a feeling I can only describe as recognition. Not of her. I barely knew her. But a recognition of something my body had apparently been carrying for longer than my mind was willing to admit. A recognition of something that fit into a shape I had not known I had been waiting to fill. My gut, in other words, already knew. It had known for a while. It had simply been waiting for someone to give it permission to know it out loud. I opened the door wider. I told her to come inside. She sat at my kitchen table for 45 minutes. She had screenshots on her phone, photographs she had taken of the computer screen in Jerome's office. Grainy, taken quickly, clearly captured by someone who was afraid of being discovered at any moment, but legible enough. She showed me the email chain with Darnell Okafor. She showed me the reference to the boat operator and the method of payment. She showed me the date, day 3, which was 3 days away from the morning we were speaking. She showed me the document that detailed the inheritance research Jerome had commissioned, the one that mapped exactly what would transfer to him upon my death, and how quickly he could assert operational control of the company. I sat across from her, and I read every word. My coffee went cold. The morning got lighter outside the windows. Somewhere upstairs, Jerome was still asleep. The more she talked, the more things that had not made sense began to make a horrible kind of sense. The way Jerome had seemed almost overly interested, in the weeks before the trip, in whether I had updated my will. He had mentioned it casually twice, framing it as something responsible adults should take care of, something he had already done for his own documents, something we should do together soon. I had agreed, distantly, and then let it fall off my mental list. He had not pushed. He had not needed to. He was not trying to get me to update my will. He was confirming, very carefully, that I had not. The way he had steered the vacation planning so thoroughly, every element of the trip had come through him. The island, the accommodation, the itinerary, the activities. He had presented it as a gift, as something he had put thought and care into. I had been touched by it. I had told Tamara Brooks, my closest friend, that I felt like I was finally getting my husband back after a period of distance between us that I had chalked up to work pressure. Tamara had been glad for me. I had been glad for myself. We had both been wrong in the same direction. The most important decision I made in the 2 hours following Claire's arrival was the one I did not make. I did not walk upstairs and confront Jerome. I did not call his name from the kitchen. I did not stand in the doorway of our bedroom and watch his face as the truth collapsed between us. I wanted to. Every instinct in me that was built from 7 years of loving him, the legitimate love, the real love, the love that had existed before any of this, wanted to demand an explanation. Wanted to give him the chance to deny it. But Claire had been very direct with me. She said, "If he knows you know before you leave this house, I do not know what he does." And she was right. I knew she was right. Because the man I was now understanding my husband to be was not the man I had thought I was married to. He had planned the logistics of my death with the same focus he brought to quarterly planning meetings. A man like that does not respond to confrontation the way the man I thought I knew would. I had to act normally. I had to be his wife, for just a little while longer, while I did what I needed to do. I called Nathaniel Cross from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house. Nathaniel had been my mother's attorney for over 2 decades. He had been at her funeral. He had held my hand through the estate process. He was, of all the people in my life, the one who understood both the legal architecture of my mother's legacy and the personal weight of what it meant to me. I told him I needed to see him immediately. I told him not to use the main office line or any channel that ran through the company's communications infrastructure. He did not ask why. He said, "I will clear my morning." What Nathaniel found when he pulled the company's filing records was not a surprise to him, though it was a devastation to me. Over the course of 2 years, Jerome had filed a series of amendments, small, individually unremarkable alterations to the company's governance structure. Each one had been processed through the normal channels. Each one had, in isolation, a plausible operational justification. But together, viewed as a sequence, they told a clear story. They were quietly, methodically shifting operational authority toward the CEO, toward Jerome, in ways that would have made it significantly easier for him to assert control in the event that the primary owner was incapacitated or deceased. Nathaniel looked across the table at me after he had laid it all out and said, "Diana, if you had left on that trip and not come back, Jerome would have had a credible legal basis, within 90 days, to declare the primary ownership seat effectively vacant and assume full executive control. The company your mother built would have belonged to Jerome Washington, and whatever arrangements he had made with Darnell Okafor. 90 days. That is all the time that stood between my mother's legacy and the people who wanted to take it." Nathaniel began filing immediately. An emergency corporate governance petition. A protective trust structure that required multiple independent signatories to alter. An updated set of beneficiary documents that removed Jerome entirely and established a clear succession path to a board of trustees I selected myself. He worked through the afternoon. His team worked through the evening. Claire, who had stayed by choice, gave a formal recorded statement. She was terrified. Her hands shook while she spoke. She spoke clearly and completely anyway. I called Tamara Brooks that afternoon. She is one of the steadiest people I know, a woman whose first response to almost anything is to slow down, look at it from every angle, and ask the hard questions before she commits to a position. She asked me if I was sure. She said, "Diana, baby, this is Jerome we are talking about." And I understood why she asked. I understood that the version of Jerome that existed in Tamara's experience was the same version that had existed in mine for most of our marriage, charming, attentive, the man who had held me on the night my mother died and told me that everything was going to be all right. That version of Jerome was real. It had been real. And that was perhaps the most disorienting part of all of it, not the betrayal itself, but the fact that the love had also been real, at least for a while, and that both things could be true at the same time. I said to Tamara, "I am sure." And then I told her about the boat. Booked for day 3. Paid in cash. In a remote stretch of ocean known for dangerous currents. Tamara was silent for a long time. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" That was the only answer I needed from her. The morning of the scheduled departure, I came downstairs at 7:15, and acted like a woman going on vacation. I wore the outfit I had laid out the night before. I ate half of a piece of toast. I double-checked my carry-on with the focused, slightly anxious energy of a traveler, which required no performance at all because I was, in fact, deeply anxious, just not about the things Jerome thought I was anxious about. Jerome came downstairs at 7:30 with the ease of a man who had slept well. He was freshly dressed. He smelled like the cologne I had bought him for his last birthday. He kissed me on the cheek and asked if I was ready. I told him I was. He picked up the larger bag with the practiced confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control of what was about to happen. And in that moment, watching him move through our kitchen with that particular quality of calm, the settled, unhurried calm of someone who believes they have accounted for every variable, I felt something clarify inside me. Not anger. Not grief. Just clarity. The kind that comes when you stop hoping you are wrong about something and accept that you are right. We never made it to the gate. Nathaniel had coordinated carefully with the relevant authorities in the days prior, sharing the evidence Claire had provided and the documentation his team had pulled from the company's filing records. The boat operator had been contacted independently and, faced with the weight of what he was being asked to account for, had cooperated. The transfers from Darnell Okafor's business accounts had been traced. Darnell himself had already been apprehended that morning, separately, before Jerome and I ever left the house, a fact that Jerome did not know. We walked into the departures hall of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 8:17 a.m. Nathaniel was already there. 2 federal investigators were already there. And standing just to the left of the check-in counters, in a dark coat, her hands very still in front of her in that same deliberate way I had first noticed on my porch 3 days earlier, was Claire Hartley. Jerome saw her before he saw anyone else. I was watching his face when he registered her presence. I watched the confidence leave it. I watched the careful, constructed composure of a man who had planned for everything begin to come apart at the seams, because he had not planned for this. He had not planned for the possibility that the woman who sat outside his office every day, the woman he had trusted with his schedule and his correspondence and his digital files, had found the folder. Had read the emails. Had gotten in her car before sunrise and driven to my house to give me what she knew. Nathaniel stepped forward. He said, "Mr. Washington, I think we need to have a conversation." Jerome looked at me once. Just once. And in that look was the entire history of 7 years, the gala where we met, the proposal in the backyard, my mother's funeral, the kitchen table where he had held my hand and told me he would protect everything she built. All of it in a single glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and communicated everything that would never be spoken out loud between us again. And then he looked away. Jerome Washington was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and corporate fraud. The investigation that followed was thorough, and the evidence that emerged over the course of it was more extensive than even I had initially known: the communications with the boat operator, the financial transfers, the legal consultations Jerome had conducted under false pretenses, and a series of smaller deceptions dating back nearly 2 years that, laid end to end, painted the portrait of a man who had made a decision, and then spent an enormous amount of time and energy making sure every path was cleared. Darnell Okafor entered into a plea arrangement and cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge. The boat operator gave a full statement. The case, in the end, was not built on a single piece of evidence or a single witness. It was built on the cumulative weight of everything Jerome had put in motion, and the one variable he had failed to account for. Researchers and investigators who have studied cases of financially motivated intimate partner conspiracy, and there are more of them than most people realize, across every income level and every demographic, will tell you that the most common failure point in these schemes is not the evidence trail, as careful as some perpetrators are about covering it. It is proximity. It is the person who is close enough to see what is actually happening. The person inside the inner circle who, for whatever reason, conscience, circumstance, courage, decides that what they know cannot stay with them. In case after documented case, it is not the investigators who crack these things open first. It is the person who was trusted to be silent and chose not to be. Claire Hartley returned to her apartment the morning of the airport confrontation. Her visa status was protected through the cooperation she had provided. She had been granted full legal witness cooperation status, which meant her employment situation, while clearly no longer viable, did not immediately affect her right to remain in the country. She took some time. She found new work. She is doing well. We have dinner together a few times a year. She is not the kind of person who wants to be described as a hero, and she has told me that directly, so I will honor that. But I will say what I believe to be true: she made a choice at enormous personal cost, for a woman she barely knew, because her conscience would not let her do anything else. And I am alive because of it. My mother's company, the company that Evelyn Washington built with $3,000 and a vision and 30 years of unbreakable will, is still operating. Its client list has grown. Its staff still comes to work every morning, and does the work she designed it to do. I sit in the CEO chair now. The chair that, by her intention, was always meant to be mine. I did not get here the way either of us imagined. But I am here. And I think, wherever she is, she would have something very pointed to say about the man who tried to take it, and something very warm to say about the Australian woman who drove across town before sunrise to make sure he did not succeed. I think about the decisions that could have gone differently at every turn in this story. I think about the night I almost did not answer the door. I think about the office where Claire sat alone with something she could have closed and walked away from. I think about Nathaniel Cross, who cleared his morning without asking questions, because he had known my mother long enough to understand that when something is urgent, it is urgent. I think about how many turns this story took, how many moments where a slightly different choice, a slightly different hesitation, a slightly different calculation of risk and reward, would have produced a completely different outcome. I do not take lightly the fact that the outcome I got to live was the one I got. My mother used to say, "The company will tell you who people really are. Give someone access to what you have built, give them power over it, authority within it, proximity to everything that sustains it, and watch what they do with it. Watch whether their character rises to meet the weight of what you have trusted them with, or whether it reveals something you were not meant to see." Jerome Washington revealed himself. He revealed himself slowly, over 2 years, in private email chains and legal consultations and a folder on a company computer with a date, and a name, and the word final. He revealed himself to a woman he had trusted to be invisible. He revealed himself completely. But Claire Hartley also revealed herself. And I would rather live in a world where the Claires exist than spend one more moment mourning the Jeromes. My mother built something real. It is still standing. I am still standing. And I answer every door now, because you genuinely never know which knock is the one that saves your life.